Hi everybody, I'm Stuart Hillard and welcome back to my channel. Now in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to make my Danish woven hearts quilt, which I've got hanging right behind me. Danish woven hearts are a traditional Christmas decoration and they're enjoyed all over Scandinavia, but they originate in Denmark. I was really inspired by the simple lines and the checkerboard center of the heart to make this quilt. And even though it looks difficult, you'll be surprised at how easy it is. It's easy enough for beginners. The quilt that I've got hanging behind me is 66 inches square and consists of 4 really big blocks, 4 24-inch blocks with some pieced sashing in between. But we're going to make 12-inch blocks and sew them together to make the actual quilt. So we'll get started and I'll run through what you're going to need to make your version of my Danish hearts quilt. So let's go through first of all the things that you're going to need to make my Danish woven hearts quilt. I've used Tilda's beautiful new fabric range, which is called Old Rose. And for your main feature prints, and in my quilt that's the hearts, I've used 8 different fabrics. I've used 2 greens, 2 blues, 2 purples, and 2 reddy pinks. And you'll just need a fat quarter or a long quarter of each of those fabrics. Now for the background fabric, that includes sort of creamy type fabric for the background of the hearts, but also for all of the sashings, you're going to need about 2.5 meters. And then for your red in your sashings, you're going to need about 1.5 meters. Those quantities are reasonably generous. And what I've done actually is to use several different looky-likey fabrics. So you could buy a bunch of fat quarters or long quarters, or even delve into your stash. And that way, if you run out of a particular fabric, you can always dip in and put something else in, and no one's going to look and think, oh, there's a totally different cream fabric in your quilt. It's such a relaxed way of working out the quantities of fabric. But if you're buying yardage, 2.5 meters of cream and 1.5 meters of a red or a pink for those sashing strips, and that will cover you. For the binding around the outside edge, you're going to need enough fabric to cut 7 2.5-inch strips, okay? And then you'll also need a piece of quilt batting and backing fabric. Your whole quilt is going to be 66 inches square, so around about a 70-inch square of backing fabric and quilt batting. But let's get started and let's look at how we're going to actually piece the blocks. And we're going to start by piecing 1 Danish woven heart block. And that block finishes at 12 inches. So what you're going to need first of all is you're going to need some strips of fabric. And these strips are cut at 2.5 inches wide, and they just need to be half the width of your fabric, so approximately 21 inches. So you could cut these from a fat quarter, 1 2.5-inch strip, and 1 in a dark and 1 in a lighter. And I've used purple for this example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by sewing these 2 strips together, and I'm going to put the 2 selve edges together. Now I'm not going to pin these strips together, but what I am going to do is make sure as I sew that I keep the raw edges really nicely aligned. I've got my 1/4-inch foot already attached to my sewing machine, and when I start any seam, I always hold on to the top and the bobbin thread, and as I take that first stitch or 2, I gently pull back on the threads. What that does is just helps to guide the fabric through the feed dogs when we're starting. So pedal to the metal. Let's turn the speed right up. That's more like it. And we're going to sew these strips together. Okay, that was easy. So clip your threads off and toss them away. And then what I'm going to do is set my seam and press my seam allowance towards the darker fabric. So setting your seam just means running an iron along the seam as you've sewn it, and then we're going to flip open the 2 strips of fabric and push that seam allowance up towards the darker fabric. And then when you press seams, particularly when you're pressing seams on long strips, I would always recommend that you run your iron in the same direction as the seam. Don't run your iron against the seam, because that's how you end up bowing your seam or bowing your strips and creating a rainbow effect. And although I love rainbows, not in my quilts, not in this quilt anyway. That's a different quilt altogether. Okay, so I've got my 2 strips sewn together and I've got my seam allowance pressed towards the dark side. And now what I'm going to do is just cut it in half. Really easy, and this doesn't have to be done with any great degree of accuracy. So I've just got it folded, and then I'm just going to cut a slither of the fold off. And what that does now is means I've got 2 halves. And what I'm going to do is switch them around so that I have got dark to light, and then I'm going to sew those together as well. Now, this technique is known as strip piecing, and it's a brilliant way of making quick patchwork that looks like you spent hours sewing loads of little squares together, but you didn't. You sewed a few strips together and then chopped them up. Okay, so I've sewn dark, light, and I'm going to do exactly the same as I did before. I'm going to set my seam, and then I'm going to press that seam allowance towards the darker fabric. And then run my iron in the same direction as the seam that I've sewn. Okay, so I've got that done, and now all I need to do is chop this up into 4 segments, and I need each of those segments to be 2.5 inches wide. Now, whenever you're cutting up a strip-pieced segment, it's a really, really good idea to line up as many lines on your ruler as you can with the seam lines that you've actually sewn. This helps to ensure that not only is the edge of your patchwork straight, but it also means that, you know, everything further down the line is straight and true. So I've trimmed off one edge, turned my patchwork around, and now I'm simply going to cut 4 2.5 inch wide segments from that strip set. And while you're doing this, try and keep lines on your ruler matched up with your piecing lines, and that way everything will stay straight and square and true, and you won't end up with wonky squares. You can see there's only a little bit left. So when you're trimming off the raw edge, when you start your cutting, just cut off a slither. You don't want to cut off more than is necessary. Okay, so now I've got my 4 strip-pieced units. They all look the same. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to twist and turn so that I end up with a checkerboard effect. So I always like to do that on the board next to me, first of all, just to make sure that everything looks as it should and everything's in the right order. So I've just turned every other strip upside down to create that checkerboard. Now that in itself is a really cute block and a great way of making a scrappy quilt. So there's an extra quilt idea. And now all we need to do is sew these together into pairs. Now again, I'm not going to pin this, but you can pin it at the intersections if you want. But because we've pressed all our seam allowances towards the dark side, and then we've turned alternate strips, what will happen is that your seam intersections will lock together and the seam allowances will be going in opposite directions. And all I really have to do is, as I'm sewing, get to the next intersection, line them up, sew to the next intersection, and then keep going. Now, as a way of saving a little bit of thread and saving a little bit of time, I'm going to chain piece. So rather than cutting my patchwork threads now and then starting a new line of thread, I'm just going to butt the next set of strips and keep going. And I'd always recommend making one block in its entirety, first of all, before you start chain piecing a whole quilt. So make one of the blocks, and then, hey, you could do a whole bunch of these. So once you've done that and you've sewn them back together, you can see now we're starting to get that checkerboard effect that we've got in the center of the woven hearts. So all I need to do now is sew these two halves together and then give the whole thing a good press. So line up your intersections, hold on to your threads, and away you go. Perfect. There we go. So we've got our checkerboard all pieced together. All I've got left to do is set my seams and press my seam allowances. And this time, because we can't necessarily press towards the dark side, I'm just going to press my seam allowances in one direction, and that will be fine. I like a little bit of steam when I'm making my patchwork, but I always press down when I'm doing it. I'm never rubbing my iron back and forth, which can distort your fabric. So that is the main part of my block already made, quick and easy, 16 patch using strip piecing. And there we go, it's done. So I can put this to one side and let me show you the next part of the block. Now then, for the next part of the block, you're going to need 2 rectangles of fabric, and we're going to use exactly the same fabrics that we used for our checkerboard. So I've got one dark purple and I've got one light purple, and these 2 rectangles are cut 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches. So we've got a nice rectangle of fabric, and we'll need 2 of those, one light and one dark. And then I'm also going to use some small squares of background fabric. This is when you need your cream fabric. Now you're going to need to cut 8 2.5-inch squares per block out of your cream fabric or your background fabric. Okay, so I've got these right here. And what you need to do on the back of them is to mark the diagonal from corner to corner using a pencil or a fabric marking pen. My favourite pen or pencil for doing this is a propeller pencil. And the reason why I like a propeller pencil is because the lead is always one thickness. It's always really fine and it stays consistent. Even if you're an hour into marking, it's the same thickness. Whereas if you use an ordinary pencil, the more you use it, the thicker the pencil line becomes, and your accuracy can be thrown out of whack. So try a propeller pencil and make sure that your line goes from corner to corner. Now then, I'm going to pin these in place and then I'm going to show you exactly where you need them to be. Essentially, we're going to position our 2 corners on opposite sides of the rectangle, all right? And if you're using a directional fabric, you want them to be at the top of that fabric, okay? So if I show you now, can you see what I've done? I've put the 2 squares on the top of the rectangle on opposite ends, and the diagonal line, the pencil line that I've drawn, is chopping off the corners. Think of the roof of a house. When you look at your rectangle with your squares on top, if your pencil lines form the roof of a house, you've got it right. Now, all we've got to do now is sew on that pencil line. Now, my usual tip whenever doing something like this is to sew a hair's width, a needle's width towards the outer corner. So very slightly off the line, but I mean literally a thread's width. But you can try it both ways and see which gives you a better accuracy. It kind of depends on the thickness of your pencil line. So we're going to start at that corner. This is where my tip about holding on to the threads is really going to help, because there's almost nothing on the feed dogs. There's almost no fabric on the feed dogs. And this is the classic time that your sewing machine starts chewing up the fabric. If you hold on to your top and bobbin thread and gently pull back on them as you take those first stitches, you'll never get that chewed up mess ever again. So I'm going to sew that diagonal and cut my threads. I'll get rid of the pin now. And then I'll do exactly the same on the opposite corner. So hold on to the threads and gently pull back. Take my pin out before I get to it. cut my threads. Okay, so I've sewn on those diagonals now, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to press that triangle back on itself. Don't trim anything off at this stage. Now, a lot of instructions will tell you to trim that corner off and then press back, but I don't want you to do that. I want you to press your triangle back first. And when you press that triangle back, what you're looking for is, does it fit the fabric that's there exactly? Does it sit right on top with nothing hanging over, no little gaps? If it does, you've done a perfect job, you're good to go. Once it's pressed, you can flip that corner back and trim off the excess at the back. If it doesn't sit exactly where you want it to, whip those threads out, have another go. As soon as you cut your fabric, you've committed. But if you haven't cut your fabric, you can keep going at it until it is perfect. And that's what we want, perfect patchwork, right? Or as near to as we can manage. Okay, so I'm happy with those corners. So all I'm going to do now, I like to use scissors for this. I'll flip it back to how it was when I sewed it. And then I'm just going to trim up to about 1/4 inch. So you can just about see there now what's left. I've got about 1/4 inch of seam allowance and everything's going to fit. So we don't have any excess bulk behind the triangle, but we know that it's perfect because we didn't trim straight away. So you're going to do that with your dark rectangle, and then you're going to do exactly the same with your light rectangle. And I'll just trim those corners away while I'm at it. And then we can get to putting this block together. Now you need one more patch cut for this block, and that is a 4.5 inch square of background fabric. So I've got that right here, and I can put my block together now. I told you this was easy. So now that you've made your checkerboard and the tops of your hearts, you just need to sew them together. So what I'm going to do is start by sewing the top of the purple, the dark purple heart, onto the checkerboard. So right sides together, and here I always think it's a good idea to put a few pins in. So match up your ends first of all. There's nothing to match really apart from the ends. I love quilt blocks like that, don't you? That have nothing really to match apart from the beginning and the end. So I'll always pin at both ends first and then pin in the middle, just so that everything holds together nicely and doesn't shift around while I'm sewing. So again, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your pins out as you get to them. That's done. That was easy. So there's the piece that I've made now. So that's the top of the dark purple heart, and that's joined onto the checkerboard. And then the other piece that I'm going to make is that cream or background 4.5 inch square, and I'm going to sew that to the top end of the other, the light purple heart. So again, right sides together and match up the ends. We'll put a pin in, just one in the middle, just to hold everything steady. And sew that seam. Now, when we press, if you remember to press towards the square on both of your sections, you'll be fine. So we're going to press the seam allowance towards the square, and on this piece, towards the square. And that way, our seams will be offset and everything will go together beautifully. So we'll set our seams and then press them. And again, I always like to press my seam in the direction that I've sewn it in so that nothing gets distorted. And just press your seam allowances towards those squares. And then last thing, we can just match up our seam allowances, then match up the ends, and then do a bit of pinning in between. So that's my checklist whenever I'm pinning blocks together or pinning units together. I'll pin any parts of the block that need to match first. I'll pin the beginning and the end, because again, that's a point that needs to match. And then if I need to, I'll do a little bit of tweaking and adjusting. But if I've done accurate cutting and an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, everything should just fit together. If you find that consistently your blocks aren't fitting together, it's a warning sign really that something needs adjusting. Your seam allowance needs adjusting, or maybe your cutting isn't as accurate as you'd like it to be. And that's the biggest reason why you should always make one block in its entirety before you cut out or piece anything else. So don't even cut the whole quilt out, first of all, because there might be a fabric in there you don't even like. And then if you've cut the whole quilt out, you're kind of stuck with it. So last thing of all is just to press that final seam back. And there is my finished heart block, my Danish woven heart block. And that is quick and easy, very simple, straight line sewing. I've only had to cut squares and rectangles, so they're simple, easy shapes. And the final result looks great and it's accurate, which is the main thing. Okay, so that should be a 12.5 inch block from raw edge to raw edge. At this point, it's a really good idea to measure that block, check that it's the right size before you start making anything else. And that way you know that your sashing's gonna fit, your borders are gonna fit as well. Now, what you're gonna need for each mega block is you're gonna need 4 of those heart blocks per mega block. And you'll need 4 mega blocks in total, so 16 individual hearts. And I did 4 purple, 4 green, 4 blue, and 4 pinky reds, and then kind of switch the colours around, switch the fabrics around to create a nice pleasing effect. And then I sewed them together, and what you can see right behind me is that mega block, which again should measure 24.5 inches from raw edge to raw edge, 24 inch finished. Now, once you've got those mega blocks pieced and pressed, you can put them to one side and you need to work on your sashing. Now, the sashings for this quilt are made in exactly the same way, really, as we strip pieced that original checkerboard. They're strip pieced units that are then trimmed to size. Now, each of your main sashing units consists of a light fabric cream, 2.5 inch strip, and then a red 2.5 inch strip through the center, and then another cream 2.5 inch strip on the other side. So we're creating almost like a jam sandwich, bread, jam, and bread. Now, I cut my strips at about 25 inches long, and then sewed them together, pressed my seam allowances, and then I trimmed the whole unit down to 24.5 inches. That just gives me a little bit of wiggle room to neaten up the edges, and it's so much easier than cutting 3 24.5 inch strips and trying to get the edges absolutely perfect. I mean, who's got time for that? I'd rather lose 1/2 inch of fabric and trim the ends off. So try that, it really does work. Now, because it's 24.5 inches and your usable fabric width is going to be about 42, you're going to end up with bits of fabric left over. And of course, we don't want to waste those. We're going to join those cut-off pieces, the remainder of our strip. We're going to piece them back together again, and then we're going to use them to make other parts of the sashing. But when we join the fabric strips together, we want to do so in a way that's not really noticeable. So I've got 2 light strips of fabric here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to join them together using a diagonal seam. Now, to make a diagonal seam, what we're going to do is we're going to create effectively an L shape, like this, or like a right angle. so that we've got our 2 pieces of fabric at right angles. And then we're going to sew diagonally from corner to corner. Now, you can mark that with a pencil, just like we did on the flippy corners on the heart block, if you want to. I usually eyeball it. And, you know, so long as you start well and end well and stay fairly straight in the middle, you'll probably be okay. If that's too slapdash for you, that's okay. You can mark that line with a pencil, all right? So I'm going to put those 2 together, and then I'm going to sew my diagonal. Whenever I put it through the sewing machine, I always want it to look like a backwards L. And then I sew from top right to bottom left. And I actually like to sort of stagger my strips slightly, so I've got a very clear start point and finish point. So I've stitched my diagonal seam, and then what happens is when you open it out, you've got a lovely straight strip of fabric. Rather than having a straight seam across the middle, it's diagonal. And it just sort of fools the eye into not seeing the seam. And it works particularly well if you've got kind of a busy print or quite a small print or even no print at all. And all you would do there is just cut off the seam allowances or the triangles of fabric that are left down to about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I like to press that seam open. It just distributes the bulk. It means that join is virtually imperceptible. And then you can use all those strips of fabric that are leftovers, but part of your quilt. So when you're making your sashing, you'll need to make 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 sections. 10 sashing sections, okay? And then the last thing that you'll need to make are the cornerstones. Now the cornerstone is this part here, which is a 9 patch, which is another classic patchwork block, which we can easily strip piece. And I'm going to show you next how to do that. So for your 9 patch cornerstones, you're going to need to make a couple of strip sets. You'll need to make a strip set which is red or pink, and then your background, your cream, and then your red or pink again. So that's one strip set. And then you'll need a second strip set, which is light, and then the dark, the pink, and then the light background again. And you're going to need twice as much of this one, because we're going to cut 2 segments of this for every 1 segment of this. And they're just made with 2.5 inch strips. So once that's done, we can just trim one end off, like that, flip the whole thing around, and then we're just cutting 2.5 inch wide segments of this. Now, you'll make these using whole lengths of fabric. I've just done a little short length of fabric to show you how to do this. So we'll need 2 of those. I'll pop those to one side. And then we're going to need 1 of these for every cornerstone. Now, cornerstone-wise, you need to make 9 cornerstones for my finished quilt. And they don't take long at all. But you could also use this 9 patch block to make a quilt all on its own. So we just need 1 of those per cornerstone. And then just like we did with the center of the Danish woven heart, we're going to rearrange those strips and sew these back together, and that will create our 9 patch cornerstone for our quilt. Really, really easy. So let's sew those back together now. Let's sew this last seam then. Again, just matching up your seam intersections. Your seam allowances should be going in opposite directions. Just make sure you've pressed them towards that pink or red fabric. And then we'll give this final block a little press. And you'll see there how easily we've made a 9 patch cornerstone unit. And that should measure 6.5 inches square, raw edge to raw edge. It'll be 6 inches finished once it's in the quilt. And there we go. There's my little cornerstone block, all finished. And you'll just need 9 of these for my Danish woven hearts quilt. So next I'm just going to talk you through how you're going to piece the whole quilt together, and then you'll be ready to quilt it. Okay, so once you've made all of your blocks, it's time to lay them out and create a quilt. Now I've got one suggestion here for how you might lay the quilt out, but I mean, there's loads of different ways that you could use this block. You could just make one block and sash it and make it into a cushion. You could put 3 or 4 together to make a table runner, with or without sashing. You could set them on point. On point simply means, you know, kind of that way rather than that way. You could put, you know, plain blocks in between your piece blocks as well. That would look lovely too. So, you know, play around with it. And I always like to do that before I start sewing blocks together anyway. So I never make sections of a quilt. But just to talk through what I did here, I picked one of each colour and then I pieced them together with the centres of the hearts in the middle of that mega block. You could easily turn these around so they were going the other way, and that would give a different look to it. But what I did do in my quilt was I grouped all of the reds and pinks so they were coming together in the centre. I thought that created a really nice warm focal point, but you could easily have it more random and mixed up than that. So once you're happy with your layout, sew your blocks together and then add your sashings. And the way we're going to put this whole quilt together is a very, very simple horizontal set. So what you'll need to do, and it's easiest if you lay this out either on a bed or on the floor or on a table nearby, and then we're going to sew together long strips. So we're going to start with a 9-patch cornerstone and then a strip of sashing, a 9-patch and a sashing and a 9-patch. So sew together in one long strip. Then our next row is going to go sashing, sewn to our mega block, sewn to another sashing, to another mega block, and then another sashing. So we've got 2 rows, a thin row and a wide row. So we'll have rows 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And that's it, 5 rows, and then the last thing to do is to sew them together. And just use the same principle when you're sewing your rows together that I did for all of my patchwork. Match up the ends and pin there. Match up the bits that are really important that need to match. So things like where the cornerstone meets the block. That really needs to match. So here and here and here and so on. Pin there and then pin in between. And get it all nicely fitted together so that when you're looking at it or other people are looking at it, we always naturally go for the parts that we know are supposed to match, and we check there, and we can't really see what's going on in between. Hurrah, that's the result for me. And sew them together. Once you've done that, give it a good press, layer it with your batting and your backing, and quilt it. Now I'm going to talk through the design that I used for free motion quilting this in a second, but you could have this long-armed if you prefer. You could do straight line quilting, but I'll just show you a quilting idea that I used for this quilt. Quilt patterns usually say at the end, don't they, those 3 little words, quilt as desired. I mean, I do it myself, and it's annoying. I know it's annoying, because you think, how do I quilt it? Well, anyway, I'm just going to show you how I quilted my version, and you know, that might give you an idea. So basically, I did hearts and echoed hearts and some swirls. So I'll just show you how I quilted it. So I would start with a kind of quilting a bit of a heart, and then backtracking, and then a little bit of a swirl, and then into another heart, and maybe another, and a swirl. And then it's really nice if you have some hearts that go under as well. And you can always go off and echo back around to get into another space. And so just those double hearts and swirls all over the surface of your quilt can create really nice texture, and then you just get a little bit of heart and a little bit of swirl every now and then showing through. So that's just one idea of how you might quilt your woven Danish hearts quilt. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and you'll join me on the next tutorial and the next video on my YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.